Madam President, this senator has conferred with the administration on its proposal in the Atlantic seaboard for their drilling. At least the administration listened to this senator and kept the Atlantic area off of my state of Florida from proposed drilling leases for this next 5-year lease period. They did that last year, and we are grateful that they did that for the reasons that we have fought for years to keep drilling off of the coast of Florida, not only what you immediately anticipate, tourism, the environment, but also our military training and testing areas. So this senator made the argument to the Obama administrations, if you're coming out there with leases off the Atlantic seaboard, don't put it off of Florida. We have military and intelligence rockets coming out of Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. We have the rockets coming out of the Kennedy Space Center for NASA. Obviously, you can't have oil rigs out there where you're dropping the first stages of these rockets. And the administration complied. But the administration then went on to offer for lease tracts of the Atlantic Ocean from the Georgia line all the way through the Carolinas, including up to the northern end of Virginia. Very interesting. Just this morning, the administration has walked back the offering of those leases off the eastern seaboard of the United States. Now, it's certainly good news, not only for certainly the fact that they never did it in the first place off of Florida, but it's good news for the Atlantic coast residents who then fought so hard to keep the drilling off their coast. They first released this draft plan in January of 2015, a year ago, and the Department of the Interior had suggested opening up these new areas of the mid-Atlantic. As you would expect, communities up and down the Atlantic seaboard voiced their objection. And they did it in a bipartisan way. From Atlantic City to Myrtle Beach, cities and towns along the coast passed resolutions to make clear their opposition to the drilling off their shores. And obviously they weren't the only ones, because surprise, surprise, just this week, the Pentagon weighed in and voiced its concerns as having been just corroborated in the Senate Armed Services Committee when I asked the question of the Secretary of the Navy, the concerns that drilling in the mid-Atlantic region would impact the military's ability to maintain offshore readiness because of the testing and training areas. Now, Madam President, the Pentagon had voiced this 2 administrations ago with regard to drilling in the Gulf off of Florida, which is the largest testing and training area for our United States military in the world. And so today, while the Interior Department's decision to remove the Atlantic from the 5-year plan, well, what about the next 5-year plan? And what about the rigs already operating in other areas off of our coast, such as off of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas in the Gulf? Well, we've carried on this fight for now 4 decades. And today, we still have a renewed push to allow drilling off of these sensitive areas for the reasons that I've mentioned. And some of our own colleagues are offering an amendment to a little energy bill that's about energy efficiency. It's a non-germane amendment, but what they want to do is to sweeten the pot with all of the revenues for offshore drilling that would normally go to the federal government instead to go to the states. Another incentive to do that drilling by the oil industry. But what we saw was the coastal communities, in this case, the mid-Atlantic seaboard, rise up and voice objections, regardless of their partisan affiliation. We've seen again today the Pentagon raise its objection, and unfortunately, we have found a federal safety regulator found to be asleep at the switch. It's been nearly 6 years since we faced one of the greatest natural disasters that our country has ever seen. That was the Gulf oil spill. And yet, according to the GAO report released just last week, we are no better off now than we were before on that tragic accident. And as a reaction to that accident, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion that I remind you killed 11 men and sent up to almost 5 million barrels, not gallons, barrels of oil gushing into the Gulf. There were a number of questions that were asked. How could this happen? Where were the safety inspectors? Well, it soon became clear that the agency in charge, a subdivision of the Department of Interior, the Minerals Management Service, it was so cozy with the oil and gas industry that the Interior Department's own Inspector General considered it a conflict of interest. And in response to the IG's findings, the Interior Department decided to reorganize, and it split that agency, the Minerals Management Service, into 2, one in charge of leasing and the other in charge of safety. But last Friday, the GAO, what's the GAO? General Accounting Office. It's the independent, nonpartisan research arm of Congress. It released a report that found that the ongoing restructuring, that splitting in 2, actually, quote, reverses actions taken to address the post-Deepwater Horizon concerns, weakening its oversight, end of quote. The report goes on to say that the Interior Department's newly created agency in charge of safety, one of those 2 it split, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, suffers, this is the report's words, quote, a lack of coherent leadership and, quote, inconsistent guidance. And so here we are, 6 years after the Gulf oil spill, and we're weakening oversight, the very words of the report. 6 years later. Obviously, this is inexcusable. And that's why a number of us have asked the Energy and Natural Resources Committee to hold a hearing on this troubling report to get to the bottom of it. Now, at some point, the objections of the vast majority of people who live along the coast and the economies that depend on those environments and those white sandy beaches and crystal blue water and military bases that are utilizing the testing and training areas over those waters, at some point, they have to be heard. Their concerns have to be addressed. We can't have to keep having a fight every time this comes up every 5 years. It's too much at stake, and yet the fight goes on, and the new evidence mounted just last Friday, and lo and behold, the results of that new evidence this morning, pulling the plug on the leasing off the eastern coast of the United States. Madam President, I yield the floor.